Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. First and most of all, we would like to express our gratitude for your attendance here today. We are really grateful to see your excitement in PUSDEC 2022 because without your contribution and enthusiasm, this event would not be properly organized as it is. And let's not forget to express our gratitude for the God Almighty Himself. Because of His blessing, we are able to attend in this very event. And I would also like to welcome Mrs. Fadia Suryani as the headmistress of SMA Negeri 5 Yogyakarta, Ms. Ganesha Rajilan Emri as the head committee of PUSDEC 2022, and last but not least, our core educator, Mr. Farhan Zuhdi, to the opening of PUSDEC 2022 technical meeting. Note that we will do all sorts of documentation throughout today's activities, including pictures and videos. Therefore, we asked for your permission. Thank you. Before we start the technical meeting today, I would like to suggest everyone in here to pray according to each other's belief, so the technical meeting will run smoothly until the end. Prayer begins. Prayer ends. Now, for you all must have been waiting, let us cut to the case right away. I'm going to share with you the detail of today's technical meeting rundown. First, sing the national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Second, introduction on what is PUSDEC and a brief explanation of the background of our grand theme. Third, a welcome speech from Ms. Ganesha Jilan as the head committee of PUSDEC 2022 event. Fourth, a welcome speech from Mrs. Fadia Suryani as the headmistress of SMA Negeri 5 Yogyakarta. Fifth, introduction to our core educator, Mr. Farhan Zuhdi, followed by his welcome speech. Sixth, our main agenda, which is explaining about the technicalities. Seventh, Q&A session. And eighth, closing. Entering the first event, let's sing the national anthem, Indonesia Raya. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand up.
Indonesia tanah air, tanah tumpah darah. Di sanalah aku berdiri, jadi mantu ibu. Indonesia kebangsaanku, bangsa yang tanah air. Marilah kita bersatu, Indonesia bersatu. Hiduplah tanahku, hiduplah negeriku, bangsaku, rakyatku semuanya. Bangunlah jiwanya, bangunlah badannya, untuk Indonesia Raya. Indonesia Raya merdeka, merdeka, tanahku, negeriku yang ku cinta. Indonesia Raya merdeka, merdeka, hiduplah Indonesia Raya. Indonesia Raya merdeka, merdeka, tanahku, negeriku yang ku cinta. Indonesia Raya merdeka, merdeka, hiduplah Indonesia Raya.
Please have a seat. Before we go any further, for you who are curious about PUSDEC, let me explain a little about it. PUSDEC, or Puspanegara Debate Competition, is an annual external event held by SMA Negeri 5 Yogyakarta. It is an English-based debate competition as to discover the best debaters out there. To face a future that is all modern and full of competition, we are required to instill noble values in each person so that we are independent, intelligent, and wise in dealing with everything. PUSDEC 2022 event takes the theme Establishing Human to be Aware of Global Issues. We take this theme because global issues are problems that often appear across nations. For example, climate change, poverty, corruption, human trafficking, abortion, LGBTQ plus rights, food insecurity, renewable energy, etc. These issues bring very large impact on changes in trends and lives in the world. PUSDEC 2022 believes in the importance of humans, especially youth, in discussing and solving the aforementioned questions. Keeping in mind, the more young people become aware of global issues, the more human will be established to it, considering that the sooner role of millennials today is very enthusiastic. Therefore, now is the right moment to start the struggle to slowly find the solutions toward the brighter future. There we have our brief explanation about PUSDEC and its grand theme. Now let us move on to our next agenda. We have Ms. Ganeshara to deliver her speech. Ms. Ganeshara, time and place is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. I would like to welcome all of you to this Puspanegara Debate Competition held by SMA Negeri 5, Yogyakarta. It is a great honor for me to welcome all of the delegates and participants to enjoy this competition. The situation with the COVID-19 pandemic is rather disconcerting, but I don't believe that it will stop your great ambition towards self-development. Due to the unfortunate pandemic situation, this is the first time that we are having the Puspanegara Debate Competition online. We believe each and every one of you who participate in this competition is the best and the bravest, for only the brave dare to constantly challenge themselves and accomplish work. The committee of PUSDEC has been giving their consistent best performance to prepare this event. We highly appreciate and are grateful for your enthusiasm in joining PUSDEC, although we don't get to meet each other in person. We hope that you can still feel the excitement. We also hope that through this competition, you can learn new things, develop new skills, grow your perspective, and enhance your knowledge and potential. Thank you for your knowledge to take the opportunity. We wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ganeshara, for the remarkable and lovely speech. Next, we will have another welcome speech from our headmistress, Mrs. Fadia Suryani. Time and place is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Puji syukur kita panjatkan kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa taala karena atas nikmat rahmatnya pada kesempatan kali ini kami SMA Negeri 5 Yogyakarta bisa melaksanakan kegiatan PUSDEC Debat Bahasa Inggris. Yang saya hormati para peserta lomba dan para panitia pelaksanaan PUSDEC. Pada kesempatan ini adalah kesempatan yang sangat baik buat kita semua untuk melaksanakan kegiatan ini dalam rangka untuk berkompetensi, kemudian untuk meningkatkan wawasan dan ilmu pengetahuan dalam berbahasa Inggris. Mudah-mudahan kegiatan ini bisa berjalan dengan baik dan lancar. Selamat berlomba dan selamat berkompetensi, semoga mendapatkan hasil yang terbaik. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thanks to our headmistress of our remarks. And now, I would like for you all to meet our amazing and talented core educator that will accompany us throughout our journey in this year's PUSDEC event, Mr. Farhan Zuhdi. He is one of the best debaters out there. Many debating journeys he has been gone through, and the result has never been disappointed. Through his debating career, he has shown us on how capable he is of delivering such a meticulous speech with the smart brain he has. Not just that, he also has many experiences in being an educator, and there's no need to doubt his credibility. Once again, let me welcome to you all Mr. Farhan Zuhdi. Time and place is yours.
Hello everyone. You'll be seeing me in the next 2 days. I hope that you will have a wonderful and amazing experience in PUSDEC 2022, not only from the excellent motion and high quality organizing committee arrangement, but also from the lessons and the friendship that you will get along the way. May the best team wins.
Many thanks to Mr. Farhan for your speech. And now, let us come to our main agenda. To explain on the technicalities, Mr. Farhan Zuri, time and place is yours.
Hello, is my screen visible?
Loud and clear, Mr. Farhan Zuri.
Okay, thank you. So today we'll be having debate briefing for PUSDEC 2022. We will talk about just the general Asian parliamentary system, how it works, how it looks like. There will be some tech briefing as well regarding what we are going to have tomorrow. So you'll be prepared to navigate PUSDEC 2022. Directly proceeding into what is Asian parliamentary format, how does it look like? So it will be one team representing government and the other team representing opposition. It's like usual. Case building time is 30 minutes. Each speaker will speak for 7 minutes and 20 seconds for substantive speech. Meanwhile, the reply speakers will be speaking for 4 minutes and 20 seconds at maximum. Reply speaker should come from the first and second speaker, so third speaker cannot be the reply speaker. There would be motion preference, as you know, because you'll get 3 motions for one theme or one heading. You already know it because the prepared motions are designed in that way. One heading, 3 motions. And we will have 3 minutes time before case building. So 3 minutes for case building, 30 minutes for 3 minutes for the motion preference, 30 minutes for the case building. So after the motion launch, you will have 33 minutes before you actually debate the motion that is being appointed. And it's important to note that you shouldn't go to the Zoom breakout room before the motions are launched in the main room. So the debate flow will be, I'm going to do roll call, and then I'm going to do roll call. I'm going to announce the matchup after that. After the matchup, I'll be reading the motions. There will be presentation in the main room. After the motions are launched, then you can discuss with your teammates about how the priorities of that motion preference in the breakout room. And we will give you 3 minutes for that. And after that, you will be assisted by the judges in helping you to arrange the motion preference with your opponent. And after the motion is appointed, you will have 30 minutes of case building. And after that, you will be debating the motion that was being case built. So that's the debate flow on how the round will look like tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Asian parliamentary system will have this debate flow from the Prime Minister to the Leader of Opposition, which the first Speaker of Government being responded and followed by the first Speaker of the Opposition, and then Deputy Prime Minister, the second Speaker of the Government, will be responding to the first Speaker of Opposition, and then the DLO, Deputy Leader of Opposition, or the second Speaker of the Opposition team, will be following after Deputy Prime Minister. It will be going back and forth to Government Whip, and then followed by Opposition Whip. But on the reply speaker, Opposition will start first. The last speaker in the round will be the Government reply speaker. This is the explanation about the general three burdens of the three team roles that is expected to be fulfilled by teams in Asian parliamentary format. Number one, it's on the logical burden. You need to elaborate the likelihood and the impact of your claims. Just as you already know, there is a format of RL, which is assertion, and then reasoning, and then evidence, and lastly, there will be link backs. This will help you to make an explanation regarding why is your argument true. What are the factors that could supplement your claims to be more solid? What are the impacts and why are they likely to happen? So explaining in the motion of this House would ban smoking because smoking creates a lot of health issues for individuals. Explain why it is true that health issues will be arise when you smoke. What are the factors that could supplement your claims to be more solid? Then explain the data, statistics, the actual diseases that will be arise when you smoke a lot, and what are the impacts if you ban these smoking activities. What are the things that are likely to be happening? Are people going to be comply with this smoking regulation? Is the government going to be able to regulate this policy? Are people going to be generally healthier and will be not having health issues that you want to avoid as individuals in the outcomes of banning the smoking activities? Those are the things that you need to elaborate. The second burden is on the motion-based burden. So you need to address the key issues asked by the motion. Did you debate within the scope demanded by the motion is the key question. So if the motion is this House would increase tax for the developing nations, if that's the motion, then you need to debate in the scope of developing nations in general. You couldn't limit or narrow down the scope of debate only to Indonesia, even though Indonesia is one of the developing nations, but there are many developing nations that you also need to consider, you also need to discuss, like India, Malaysia, Thailand, and those other nations outside Indonesia also requires explanation. So don't try to limit the scope or the dimension of the debate into what you think is very comfortable for your side. The third burden is on the comparison or framing. You need to not only compare yourself with all the opponent's contribution, but to actively do it, to explicitly state that your argument is better than your opponent's, maybe because you make a better characterization, or you make better examples, or you explain better likelihood as to why the outcome that you envision will literally and will be definitely happening in the side that you are supporting. You also need to explain why is it more important that the argument that you state in comparison to your opponents. So explain, maybe you protect the most vulnerable actors within the debate, or you have the most scalable impacts, you have the most comprehensive benefits to large number of people. Those are the things that will be making your team have a better comparison or a better framing than the opponent side. Next, we are going to talk into the territory of speaker roles. So for this first speaker, which are the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition, you need to bring mainly two things. And just as a disclaimer, there is no rigid formula or the recommendation that is solid and obligatory or mandatory to be fulfilled in the speaker roles. This is just the general recommendation that I would give to make your speech have better structures and easier to be followed and understood by the adjudicators. For the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition, the first thing that you need to bring is definitely the stance. What is the issue that made the motion arises? And Prime Minister, you need to elaborate the definition in the motion of this House would sanction Russia for Ukraine's occupation. Then what is the definition of sanction? What is the definition of Ukraine's occupation that is being conducted by Russia right now? So define and characterize the key words that is stated by the motion. Root problems also require heavy analysis. What is the problem when Russia right now occupies Ukraine? You can explain there are a lot of war crimes. People become refugees to seek better life, to seek shelters in other nations. There is regional and geopolitical instability. So define the problems, and as well as background is very crucial to be elaborated. Why you need to sanction Russia? Maybe you can explain the background of Ukraine's occupation done by Russia is because Russia is a very powerful and wealthy nation with a lot of economic resources that can prop up their military regime. Therefore, by sanctioning Russia, you would disempower Russia in the process. Model is also very essential. When you want to sanction Russia, how does it look like? To what extent the sanction is going to be enacted? On what economic sectors that you are going to sanction Russia into? You can explain that maybe the sanction is on the oil and gas and mineral industry because that's one of the largest economic contributor to Vladimir Putin and Russia's administration. Then this sanction is only going to be done temporarily. At the point when Russia wants to stop the occupation, we will lift the sanction. So also focus on the modeling on your case will help you to structurize, will help you to navigate the debate in a better way. In leader of opposition, you may choose between number one, sticking with the status quo. So again, going back to the example of Russia and Ukraine's occupation, in opposition, you can say that we don't want to sanction Russia because right now in status quo, everything is already started to get better because Russia already tried to tone down its oppression. There is a move coming from both sides, Russia and Ukraine, that they will go to negotiation table, they will do discourse on how to end the war. Or number two, you can have a modified or improved status quo. You probably don't want to sanction Russia, but you want to increase the humanitarian aid, you want to increase the military assistance to Ukraine to balance the power with Russia. So there is no sanction, but you want to do military assistance, which is a modified or improved status quo. Or number three, you can create an entirely new proposal. Again, it has to be mutually exclusive. Maybe you explain that we don't want to have sanction, but we want to create an entirely new proposal in which that we are going to just invade Russia probably, or you want to make a military pact with Ukraine to increase their military regaining power against Russia and take back the territory that has been claimed. But you need to explain why this new proposal is mutually exclusive with the government side proposal. So if you want to make this military pact or military organization to combat Russia's power, then explain why it's mutually exclusive with sanction. Excuse me for a sorry for the pause. And the next thing after stance is the arguments. You need to start with what you believe to be the most valuable and important in the debate according to the motion. So start with the arguments that is the most intuitive one. If the motion is this House would prioritize economic redistribution for Indonesia, then you need to explain why the redistribution in Indonesia is very important, probably because you need to equalize the economic development in between regions in Indonesia to give people more jobs, to give people better livelihood, those kind of things. Leader of opposition should respond to the Prime Minister on top of delivering new arguments. So don't only bring response, but don't explain anything that is positively argumentative in your side of the house. Vice versa, don't only bring arguments when you don't think that there is the response that you can give. So do your best to balance response. Next, for the deputies, you need to provide key direct response to the opposing team. That's definitely what you should do, because that's your job to respond the previous speaker. So as the deputy prime minister, you need to respond to leader of opposition, and as deputy leader of opposition, you need to respond to deputy prime minister. The response can come from two things. Number one, from directly responding the arguments that were just being mentioned by your opponent, or responding to the response of your opponent that is directed to your first speaker's case. So it's like defending or refuting the case from your first speaker that is tried to be attacked by your opponent. So those are the two types of response that you probably want to do in deputy's side. You need to also strengthen your team by providing additional arguments to support or oppose a motion, ideally something that your previous speaker hasn't established. So when your first speaker focused a lot on the political or economic dimension of the motion, then probably in the second speaker you want to engage on the social or international relation aspect of the motion to expand and make your analysis becomes much more comprehensive. You also may add additional layers or points to support your teammates' explanation. So again, don't be repetitive. Don't just reiterate what your first speaker already explained. You can bring more reasoning, you can bring more comparison, more framing, or playing in the worst case scenario on your side to add these additional layers to make your case much more substantive. For the third speaker of the whip, two things that you need to do is number one, summarize and strengthen. Number two, responses. On summary and strengthening your case, it's just as important as response, especially if the summary can help the judge compare your team with the opponent. So to compare is basically to summarize. My first speaker and my second speaker already explained why there will be better political stability when you do the motion. Meanwhile, opposition explained that there will be much more political instability because of the reasons A, B, C. I'm going to prove to you why our side is more relevant and is more engaging to the spirit of the motion, as well as why our side have been responsive to most of the concerns provided by the opponents. So explain what your team has been brought in the debate, but also compare to what your opponent has been saying throughout the round, and compare those two variables and explain the tipping point why the debate is going to your side is because of the reasons that you try to explain. You may also provide additional explanations, characterizations, examples, etc., as long as they still manifest in the same conclusions laid out by your member to support their extensions. So don't just directly bring new matter. Don't just suddenly explain, I'm going to explain this new argument, because that will not be counted by the adjudicator. You shouldn't bring new substantive material that is original coming from yourself. You should only respond or provide deeper analysis, which the basis of the analysis already being brought up by your first and second speaker. In terms of responses, you need to provide the key and final responses to the previous speaker, as you are literally the last defense, the last person who could do that. Government whip needs to do a lot of response to deputy leader of opposition, and opposition whip needs to do a lot of response on government whip or deputy prime minister if there are some things that you need to clarify. You may also structure your response in a way that summarizes the comparison between your team and the opponent, usually in the form of points of clashes. There are three clashes that I'm going to mention in this round. Number one, on the political stability. Number two, on the economic growth. Number three, on the social cohesion. And then try to fit those response, include them, attach them in the bodies of these three clashes or two clashes is more than fine, and then try to conclude why after all of this consideration your side wins in each of those clashes. Sorry, this is not speaker rules for whip, this is speaker rule for the reply speech. So for the reply speaker, this is not whip, you need to provide bias adjudication regarding the debate. Let me just change it for a bit. So what is the meaning of bias adjudication regarding the debate? You can do this bias adjudication by addressing these several questions. Number one, why should your team win the debate? Maybe you can explain that because our team is the most comprehensive one. We've brought a lot of arguments with minimum responses directed by our opponent. You can also explain what is the metrics of the judgment. If you think that your side brings comprehensive principal arguments, then you can explain that the principal argument is very important because principle is the foundation of the actors within the debate, how they work, what is their interest, what is their values. Therefore, the principal analysis that is already being elaborated by your side should be the metrics of the judgment within the debate. You can also elaborate on why your team's argument is the most important, on the practical consequences, explaining you protect the most vulnerable actor, you create the most change to the solution that you bring towards the problem that exists in status quo right now, or you can also explain that our argument is the most important one because it is the most urgent thing to be done right now. In terms of explaining the team's response, you need to prove why your team's response is strongest comparing to your opponent. Maybe because we've provided the A minus, even if the worst case scenario, we've flipped them at their best. Meanwhile, our opposition didn't only, our opposition only managed to rebut or negate some of the cases that we've provided. So in terms of responsiveness, we definitely win. Or you can also address the question of what are the crucial problems of your opponent's case. Maybe you can explain that our opponents have jumpy analysis, lack of step-by-step analysis. They don't frame their argument why it's the most important one. They also have a lot of gaps between their analysis that makes it very hard to be understood by the adjudicators. So point out what is the mistake, what is the issues that is pervasive in your opponent's case might help you to win the debate through the reply speaker. Motion types. So we've done with the speaker roles, we go to the motion types. There will be 4 general motion types that I'm going to be explaining. On the first type, which is the policy motion, usually the wording is this House would. The House is the parliament of the state. So you need to focus on whether or not the policy should be implemented by the House, by the parliament of the state. Usually it's not about why X brings more harm than good or otherwise. This is not about an evaluation between the positive or negative aspects of certain subject, but rather why the value achieve a specific threshold to compel the actors or the state to do something, because the state is this house that pass the motion. Usually it requires a certain modeling or ways to implement this. So maybe in this explanation about specific threshold to compel the actor, it's still quite abstract. I'm just going to elaborate on that in the example of this house would ban private universities. This debate is not about why private university brings more harm than good. Maybe you can explain that private university have a better quality education. Maybe you can explain that private university have more bad things because there is lack of supervision within the curriculum, and it sometimes will not be in line with the state agenda. However, that's not the debate. The debate is not about the good or the bad of private universities. This debate is about why the bad of the private universities already passed a specific threshold that compelled the actor or the state to ban the private universities. Or if you don't want to ban private university because you are in the opposition side, you can explain that you shouldn't ban private university because it provides a lot of good things to the education. But even if it provides some bad things to the education, the bad things that is being presented by private university does not pass a specific threshold of the state to ban it. So you can approach this debate through that lens. The second motion type is on the analysis motion. Usually the wording is not singular. It could be this house believe that, THBT, this house oppose, THO, or this house supports, THUS. It requires you to assess whether the value of certain element, item, object, etc. is more positive or negative from a neutral observer's perspective. Most of the time, it doesn't ask for logistical or feasibility requirement. So when we already discussed the first policy motion comes from the perspective of the state, this motion does not come from the perspective of the state. Rather, it comes from the perspective of the third party or neutral observers that want the best thing to be provided to the humanity, to people in general. So the example is this house belief that private universities bring more harm than good. So you need to quantify and provide qualitative analysis as to why the harms of private universities are much more in number, but also much larger in scale than the good that private university is probably going to bring to the educational system, and vice versa. Or the motion of this house supports the abolishment of private universities, then the debate is not about the technicalities, the logistical nightmare or the feasibility requirements of abolishment of private universities. This is just an explanation that in the scenario in which that we abolish private university, or in the scenario in which that we support the abolishment of private universities, that is already a good thing. So it's not about this house would abolish private university, it's rather this house supports the abolishment of private universities, because again, it doesn't come from the perspective of the state, it comes from the perspective of neutral observers, knowledge and interests. The third motion type is on regret motion. Regret motion, usually the wording is, obviously this house regrets, THR. The debate should be about assessing whether the world would be a better place with or without the thesis stated in the motion. Themes have a benefit of hindsight. What does it mean? It means that you can look since the beginning of time, since the beginning in which that the object that we are debating upon has existed, evaluatively, are things good or are things bad? Just look into the example. This house regrets the prevalence of private universities in Indonesian educational ecosystem. So you can look since the conception of private universities, since the beginning of the time in which private universities exist in Indonesian educational ecosystem, are they already providing a lot of good benefits, or the impacts of private universities to educational system have been bad? So it's about evaluation retrospectively. Are things going to be good or are things bad because of the object that we've tried to debate upon? So the government team is then expected to provide an antithesis of that world wherein such element does not exist. So you can probably explain, in the world in which there is no prevalence of private universities in the educational ecosystem, then probably the one that will dominate the educational curriculum and educational environment is going to be the public universities, and public university will provide better access, better benefits, better fulfillment of Indonesian government's interests, those things. But you need to understand that the government team cannot fiat the antithesis, as they need to explain the likelihood of such antithesis. So you couldn't just simply fiat that in a world when there is no prevalence of private universities, suddenly all public schools will dominate and have full guaranteed access to all areas in Indonesia's educational ecosystems, but rather you need to also explain the step-by-step analysis why public universities will be the replacement, why there is interest of the government to formalize and equalize the access of public universities. And opposition can also challenge this antithesis by explaining that even if there is no prevalence of private universities, opposition can probably say that public university will not be that prevalent as the replacement because there is lack of budget, or there is lack of quality, lack of manpower, there is lack of focus by the government in educational curriculums. So you need to explain both by the government and opposition side of the house. Is the antithesis valid? Is the antithesis is the actual thing that can and already being done in the absence of those subjects that we are debating upon? So yeah, that's the regrets motion. The third types of motion is the actor motion. The wording is usually as blah blah blah. This house would / this house believe that etc. The debate is on whether or not the motion is true from the perspective of the stated actor, not from a neutral perspective, not from the state, not from the government. It's from the perspective of the actor that is stated by the motion. It means that teams must consider the stipulated actor's knowledge, values, and interests in regards with the motion. For example, as students, this house would actively call for the abolishment of private universities. Then this debate is about whether ourselves as students will be much more benefited or will be much more disadvantaged when there is an abolishment of private universities. This debate also requires some degree of technicalities. For example, as student, what does it mean to be actively calling for the abolishment of private universities? Does it mean that you are going to have, public demonstration, you are going to do social media petition, you are going to pressure the government to abolish private universities? So some modeling mechanism, making a heavy stance is also important in the actor motion type. And then after that, we are going to proceed to a definition, how to define a motion, what to do and what not to do. In defining a motion, teams are expected to debate at the level of generality implied in the motion. If no specificity is stated, then please do assume the debate takes place in any functional democracy universally. Teams can definitely exclude fringe or anomalous example. So if the motion that is provided is this house would abandon nuclear power, and then there is an argument that probably mentioned that nuclear power is creating a lot of environmental harm because the disaster that happened in Japan, and that's one of the fringe or anomalous example, then probably you can try to exclude that, or if you want to include that, you will need to prove why that's not a fringe or anomalous example, why it's something that is relevant, why the potential of those harm to be reoccurring again in the future is something that is having a high degree of potentiality or possibility. So that's not a fringe or anomalous example. You can also definitely define a detailed mechanism to implement the motion if deemed necessary. So if in the motion, if this house would abolish nuclear weapon, then a detailed mechanism to implement the motion, right? We are going to punish nation that still develop the nuclear weapon. We are going to pressure them. We are going to have international body to supervise the denuclearization process. So if you deem that this mechanism is necessary, you are more than welcome to do it. However, it is illegitimate to include only fringe or anomalous example to your case. In the motion of this house would ban fast food industry, and your argument is fast food industry creates a lot of health hazard, health issues. You shouldn't bring the example of my neighbor was just dying last week because he ate a lot of McDonald's in his life. That's just a fringe example because nobody knows your neighbor. Nobody can verify and confirm whether you are telling the truth, whether you have a neighbor that was dying because of the constant eating of McDonald's hamburger. Now, that's a fringe or anomalous example. Don't try to include that. Try to bring a more level of generality by having statistics, data, or articles that is well known by individuals. You can also try to not restrict the debate to a very specific setting without strong justification. So if the motion is this house would ban contraception, then you shouldn't only explain that we will only ban contraception in developed nation or in developing nation or Indonesia, because the debate, if there is no specificity is stated, then the debate expects universality, or it takes place in most of nations, at least in any functional democracy. You can also try to propose a mechanism that should be in line with the spirit of the motion. Don't try to squirrel your way around. So in the motion of this house would defund the police, then you shouldn't and couldn't only try to explain we will only defund the police departments that have 100% police brutality evidence, because that's not a debate. The debate expects you to explain it. You need to defund the police department generally across the nation, not only to the police department that have 100% police brutality example. Definitional challenge. So this is quite niche because it's not going to be done in any rounds, because not all rounds will have definitional challenge. It is only being conducted if the opposition teams believe that the definition set by the government is illegitimate, is invalid, or undebatable. Then at that point, you need to do definitional challenge. It has to be done by the leader of opposition, not in DLO or not in opposition whip. You need to do it as early as possible in the first speaker of the opposition in clear and explicit manner. Teams can either choose to proceed with the original definition or to propose an alternate definition with strong justification. Usually it's very fringe. So in the motion of SUN, we will sanction Myanmar, the debate is going to be revolving around as United Nation, because UN is the abbreviation, the acronym of United Nations. But if your government of the house believe that UN is Universitas Nganjuk, then you can probably try to challenge that definition that UN is not Universitas Nganjuk, but UN is United Nation. Or if the motion as International Criminal, as ICC, this house would prosecute crimes against democracy, then ICC is International Criminal Court. That's the expected definition. But if the governments of the house believe that ICC is International Cricket Council, that's not the true definition. Then you can do definitional challenge. So it's very fringe, and we are not encouraging you to do definitional challenge. Teams are expected to still engage on the main premise using the original definition. So still try to respond or engage to some extent, even if the definition provided by your government is incorrect, but it should be a last resort than the first line of defense against a poorly defined motion. So try to redefine, but also to some extent still try to engage to what the definition provided by the government side. Next, talking about Fiat. So government might assume that the motion will pass in the parliament. That's the definition of Fiat. So opposition couldn't try to respond that in the motion this house would ban zoos. Government explained this house would ban zoos because zoos are bad. Opposition couldn't say that, no, you will not be able to ban zoos because the parliament will not agree. Opposition couldn't do it because there is a fiat in the government of the house that the parliament will agree with the action to ban the zoos. Therefore, arguments about whether the parliament will pass the motion is not acceptable. In a case in which the opposition team provides a mutually exclusive counter-proposal, the Fiat also applies as long as the counter-proposal does not require more resources than the government's approval. So, for example, in the motion of as US, this House would sanction Israel for Palestinian occupation, then it's what government supposed to do is to explain why it is within the US interest to ban Israel for Israel's occupation in Palestinian territory. Opposition can explain that it's not within the interest of US because US is still a close ally with Israel. Opposition cannot say and cannot make a counter proposal that as US we will invade Israel for Palestinian territory, or as US this House would weaponize Palestinian people against Israel. Because even if it's a counter proposal that is mutually exclusive, but the action to invade Israel or the action to weaponize Palestinian people is larger and require more resources than the action to sanction Israel. So opposition couldn't fiat that analysis because opposition counter proposal requires more political, social, or economic resources that is far higher than the government's proposal. Lastly, about motion preference. So this will be helped by the adjudicators. So you will not directly do the process of motion preference, but the things that you need to know is, number one, the scenarios of motion preference, what to do in motion preference. You need to know that there is going to be 3 motions, and there will be the first motion that is the most prioritized, the second motion that is the second prioritized, and the third motion which is the least prioritized. So let's look into the example on the first scenario on the left side on your screen. The government said 1, 2, 3. So the first motion is the most prioritized, second motion is the second prioritized, third motion is the vetoed or the least prioritized. Veto means least prioritized. You don't want to debate on that motion. Veto means that you put it on the bottom. You want to ban that motion as a team. Opposition is 3 to 1. Third motion, the first prioritized, second motion, less prioritized, first motion, the least prioritized. So when that happened, the conclusion is quite simple because the government side of the House wants to veto, wants to ban the third motion because government puts it at the bottom. Meanwhile, opposition wants to veto or ban the first motion because opposition puts number 1 motion at the bottom or the last at the arrangement. Then number 3 motion will be not used, number 1 motion will not be used, then number 2 motion is the debated motion. It's quite simple. The least prioritized motion will be banned, the only other 1 motion will be used. Meanwhile, in the second type or the second scenario of motion preference, it's quite more meticulous. In this right side of your screen, government is putting first motion on the first priority, second motion on the less priority, third motion as the least prioritized motion, 1, 2, 3. Opposition is 2, 1, 3, or the third motion is being vetoed because the second motion is being put first and the first motion is being put second. So both teams try to veto, try to debate not on the third motion, try to ban the third motion. So the third motion is definitely not going to be used, but the decision on whether or not we are going to use the first or the second motion will be determined by coin toss or toss coin. So the toss coin will be done by the adjudicator. Adjudicator will be facilitating that. So let's say that in this case, government is first motion being put as the first priority, opposition the second motion put as the first priority, and government choose head, opposition choose tail. And then after the coin toss, the coin toss results into head, then government first priority motion, which is the first motion, is going to be debated upon. But if the coin toss results into tail, and opposition was choosing tail, then the second motion will be used as the debated motion. So that's how motion preference is going to be conducted. So that is all. Good luck and see you tomorrow, but there will be Q&A session. I give the floor back to the MC.
Okay, once again, thank you, Mr. Farhan, for the explanation on the technicalities. And now, to make sure that each of you fully understand on how this event will be held, we will now begin our Q&A session. For those who wish to ask about the details of PUSDEC 2022 event, may it be the rules or other technicalities, please write away your question in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask away the question. Okay, guys, I remind you again, for those who wish to ask about the details of PUSDEC 2022 event, you can just write away your question or unmute yourself and ask away the question. Okay, guys, it seems like there is no questions. And yeah, we have finally reached the end of the event. We might have to say goodbye for now, but your real journey will begin tomorrow. Good luck, debaters, on your journey tomorrow. We really hope that you will find a fabulous and remarkable journey. We wish you that tomorrow, and thank you for having to attend this meeting. We wish you all the best. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.